Welcome to the September edition of Beef Monthly. I'm Dr. Ron Lemenager, Professor and Beef Extension Specialist in the Department of Animal Science at Purdue University. This month's highlights include interviews with Neal Smith, President of the Indiana Beef Cattle Association, and Dr. Kyle Shipman, Director of Field Operations with the Indiana Board of Animal Health. In the AskDrRon segment, we'll be addressing a producer question about avoiding excess shrink when selling cattle. In the production and management section, we'll be talking about considerations for fall forages and management of both spring and fall calving herds. And now, a word from our good friends at Corteva.
Your land is more than a business. It's a heritage that has been passed down from those who tended it before you, by those who shaped it, changed it, and cared for it. Your land has a legacy, one that you carry on, but also one you build on. At Corteva Agriscience, we are the stewards of a lasting legacy. We have a responsibility to Dow AgroSciences to maintain the relationships and trust they built, and to build upon those foundations. To help you care for your land, to provide innovations that help you protect the hard work and investment you've poured into it. To help you build a legacy that can be passed on for generations to come. Corteva Agriscience.
In this segment, I'm joined by Neal Smith, who is the Indiana Beef Cattle Association president. And Neal, we just came off of a board meeting that we had some interesting things that I think our producers might be interested in hearing about. So let's start with Hoosier Beef Congress. We made a couple changes there, and let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Thanks for having me. And yes, we did just have a very good board meeting and a lot of discussion about Hoosier Beef Congress. We just met with the state fair staff, and barring any government restrictions or changes, everything looks good to go for Hoosier Beef Congress with some minor changes. Going to have to probably move the trade show to allow for some social distancing. But other than that, we're kind of planning all the traditional activities that you have at the Hoosier Beef Congress. One major change is that we did approve a small increase in entry fees. Lots of discussion about different options, but we've continued to get fee increases over the years. Our fees have crept up for bedding and for cleanup and for rental and all kinds of things, and so we made the decision this year to raise entry fees from $100 up to $125, and again that will include basically everything: the setup, the cleanup, the bedding, and everything, and all the costs that we incur that goes along with that. Showmanship is a small charge extra, and then the parking pass is just dollar for dollar to the state fair. That's their charge, not ours. So, but felt like it was time after 5 years that we needed to make a small increase, because our fees have, like I said, continually they fluctuate, but they've been continuing to go up. Over the years. So that was why we made that decision.
And it's still a pretty good bargain compared to a lot of other major shows that you might participate in. The second thing is really about Indiana Beef Cattle Convention. You might want to talk a little bit about convention.
Yeah, the convention committee has met a few times and made some changes once again. Partly because of the pandemic and partly financial decisions, but we, the staff and some of the committee members met with the Hendricks County 4-H Fairgrounds and their conference facility there, and decided that to make that move out there to Danville this year. It'd be a one-day event on January the 23rd, and that facility gives us great space to spread out, as well as have those affiliate or beef association meetings like we've had in the past, and the educational breakout sessions. And so Felt like that facility was a good fit, and obviously helps with not creating a financial burden on IBCA's budget this year with the move out of the downtown hotel type of complex.
And it ought to really be a good bargain for our producers to attend, I think, too, you know, because it's a little bit cheaper venue. The next area that was discussed is the Indiana Beef Cattle Association area beef meetings. So they, you know, we typically have done 10 meetings around the state. And this year the venue looks a little different. You might talk about that.
Yeah, once again, we've made some changes to our area beef meeting, and thanks to you and Phil Reed for all your work that you put into that each year and again this year, but have moved to one virtual area beef meeting versus the 10 meetings at 10 locations scattered around the state. Unfortunately, we won't have the social aspect and the 10 meals that goes along with that, but decided to do one, I guess, quote unquote, live virtual meeting that will be available to all 10 areas of the state at one time, and we'll look and be set up a lot like our traditional area beef meetings have, a panel with some moderator and some discussion and question and answer, and have, you know, the educational pieces to it. And so, you know, hopefully the model of the meeting will resemble the past area beef meetings. It'll just be virtual this year.
You know, and then the other major thing that we kind of spent a little bit of time talking about is the checkoff, and you know, the checkoff dollars because of the COVID-19 and how cattle were marketed or weren't marketed in some cases. And we probably just need to remind our producers that every time an animal is sold, a dollar needs to be remitted back to the Indiana Beef Cattle Association, and that, you know, 50 cents of that dollar goes on to the national for national promotion. But you know, we do have a number of online sales and production sales and freezer beef sales and private treaty sales of maybe a club calf or maybe some breeding stock. And technically each one of those transactions, you know, by federal law requires a dollar checkoff. So you might kind of add to that.
Yeah, you're right. We're just kind of using this time to remind, you know, all the producers that, you know, every time you sell an animal that you're required to pay that check off, you know, as you said, mandated by federal law, and only fair to everybody if everybody pays. So kind of just want to take this time to remind everybody, if you're selling freezer beef, that's been a big trend this year. You're selling freezer beef, if you're having an online production sale or selling, you know, replacement heifers or a breeding bull, or technically even if you give a breeding bull away or something, or trade, wouldn't probably give one away, but trade, you know, those are still required to pay the check off. So basically every time an animal is sold, you need to remit the check off. And there is a form that you can go to the Indiana Beef Cattle website and print that form and then remit that, you know, once, twice, 4 times a year, depending on whatever works best in your situation. But it is a requirement, and you know, for those of you that have already remitted, we appreciate it. You know, if you sell your cattle through a sale barn or a marketplace, you know, they collect and remit that for you. But it's those individual private sales that we're just taking this chance to remind people to remit that money as well.
And I think as as producers, it's really easy to kind of forget about, you know, those sales. And so this is just kind of a good reminder.
Yeah.
Neal, anything else that the producers would like to hear about?
I think, you know, that touches on, you know, some of the major discussions that we've had here at our board meetings lately. Anybody that's not a member, that's we would love to have the new members signing up. We work hard, both the volunteers and the staff, with lobbying both at the state house and at the national level, as well as putting on the programs and doing the promotions, and so we continue to have a lot of different diverse programs and activities, as well as legislative type activities that we're doing. So we appreciate the members that we have, and we would love anybody else that's interested in becoming a member.
Neal, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ron.
In this AskDrRon segment, I had a producer call and asked about how can I minimize excess shrink when I'm marketing my cattle. And this is a really good question that many producers don't think much about. There are really two types of shrink. The excretory shrink, which consists of urine and feces loss, and this typically happens within the first 10 to 12 hours when cattle are held off of feed and water. The recovery from this type of shrink is relatively short. The second type is tissue shrink, and this basically is a decrease in carcass weight. So we're losing moisture from carcass tissues. This tends to happen later, and for example, during long hauls or prolonged periods of fast. When we talk about types of feeds that cattle are on prior to experiencing shrink, there was a study that was done where cattle were held off of feed and water for 12 hours, having been fed grass and wet feeds like corn silage. Those cattle shrunk about 4%. In the case of finished cattle on a high concentrate diet, with 12 hours without feed and water, they shrunk about 2.5 to 3%. When those finished cattle were allowed to have access to water, they recovered part of that shrink and ended up being at about 2%. Different cattle types also have an effect on shrink. For example, if we have range cattle that are a little bit flightier, have a little bit larger flight zone, if those cattle are on an overnight stand, in other words, 12 hours without feed and water, they'll shrink about 5%. In the case of some calves in Iowa State, there was about 4,700 calves in this study, where they took some calves from ranch to feedlot. Those cattle shrunk about 7.2%. Cattle that were taken from the sale barn to the feedlot lost about 9.1%. In a Wyoming study, they looked at actually 8 hours, 16 hours, and 24 hours in dry lot, standing without feed and water. 8-hour cattle shrunk about 3.3%. 16-hour cattle and 24-hour cattle, not a lot of difference, in the mid-6s. All right. So if you notice, most of the shrink takes place early, with decreasing levels as we extend time. Wyoming study also looked at 8 hours, 16 hours, and 24 hours in a moving truck. And again, we see a similar kind of a pattern. 8-hour cattle shrunk about 5.5%. 16 hours in a moving truck shrunk just right at 8%. And 24-hour cattle just under 9%. Again, shrink happens early with a higher weight loss, and then it starts to taper off with time. Here's a study out of Ontario, Canada, where they looked at different components of management practices that affect shrink. For example, they looked at 30 minutes of gathering and sorting time, where the cattle shrunk about 0.5%. If those cattle were then weighed and loaded, they shrunk another 3%. The first 4 hours in a moving truck, they shrunk 4%. In the second 4 hours in a loaded truck, in a moving truck, they shrunk another 1%. The distance traveled in that study was 400 miles, and those cattle shrunk another 2.5%. So when we look at these collectively, it's possible that cattle could lose up to about 11% of their starting weight, okay, due to shrink. If we put that on a per pound basis, those cattle could shrink almost 66 pounds. At $1.40 a pound, that's a loss of about $91.84 just due to shrink. All right, so managing shrink becomes kind of a big deal. Here's a Missouri study on finished cattle, where they trucked the cattle 52 miles, took them off the trailer, the truck, and harvested them immediately. They shrunk about 4.6%. Cattle that were shipped 373 miles, followed by an immediate harvest, shrunk about 7.7%. Now, we did almost double those miles, okay, at 746 miles, followed by immediate harvest, and they shrunk a little bit more, but not significantly more than the first 373 miles, right at about 7.9. So cattle lose the most shrink in the first 3 hours of transport. Now, there's some other factors that kind of come into the shrink scenario. One of them is environmental conditions. During cold weather, we would expect cattle to have more excretory shrink and less tissue shrink. In hot weather, we would expect more tissue shrink and less excretory shrink. And the tissue shrink in hot weather really comes from respiration and loss of cell moisture through respiration. Another factor that affects shrink is whether or not there's an ionophore, in other words, bogatec or rumensin in the feed or the mineral. When that's included, cattle shrink less. Another factor is grazing time. There was a study that was done out west where cows were on native range, and they were either weighed in early morning or in late morning. In other words, they had time to graze. The cattle that were weighed late morning were 2.5% heavier than the cattle that were weighed in the early morning. Steers, in that similar study, handled similarly, were 1.9% heavier after 3 hours of grazing versus weighing these cattle at daybreak. And the interesting thing is that the cattle that had 3 hours of grazing also tended to shrink less at all time points throughout the day following that weight. So the take-home summary of this is that prior to transport, we probably ought to think about avoiding super wet feeds. Okay, dry hay probably is a better alternative for the last day or two before shipment. Utilizing an ionophore either in the feed or in the mineral. And making sure that we have a balanced diet, including vitamins and minerals. And the mineral portion is really kind of a key factor because that's where the electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and others that really regulates the moisture of cells within the body. And the other factor is minimizing stress during the gathering, sorting, and loading process. So low stress animal handling techniques is very significantly justified. During the transportation process, avoid sudden starts and stops, and going around curves too fast where the cattle are shifting back and forth in the trailer, okay, during the transporting process. So minimize how much the cattle have to shift. The other factor is avoiding delays. In other words, making sure that the equipment is in good condition, whether it's your equipment or you're hiring a trucker to haul your cattle. Make sure that you're hiring truckers that have good maintenance of their equipment. The other factor is avoiding weather extremes, like extremely hot and extremely cold weather conditions as you move cattle up and down the road.
Joining me today is Dr. Kyle Shipman, and he is the Director of Field Operations at the Board of Animal Health. And Kyle, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And I think today's topic really needs to deal with, you know, the official 840 identification system and the animal disease traceback. And as I remember, January 1 of 2015, Board of Animal Health implemented the USDA animal disease traceback system for all sexually intact cattle and all dairy cattle as they move across state lines. And there was a couple exceptions to that. If you were taking cattle to a slaughter facility, or you were moving, maybe if you were on the state line, if you wanted to use a veterinarian across the state line, but you were not, ownership was not transferring, or if you were moving animals directly to a facility out of the state where the animal would be identified there. I think we're the three exceptions. Is that right?
Mhm. Yes, yes. There are definitely some exceptions, especially seeking veterinary care across state lines, and not changing ownership is a key piece to that. So yeah, those three exceptions.
So at that time, there was kind of three official ID tags. Okay, the typical 840 electronic identification tag. So that's a 15-digit number that starts with 840, and there's a U.S. shield on that tag. And then there was the noose tags, which some people refer to as the bright tag. And then there was the I don't know, I'm going to say a USDA program tag, which would more than likely be a calf foot vaccination, like a brucellosis tag. So there's tell us about what the change is and what's going to happen here in the future.
Yeah, so as we go through this process, we are trying to find more efficient ways to record the identification numbers that are placed on these tags. So historically, with the noose tags or the bright tags and the calf foot vaccination tags, those metal clip tags, there's no efficient way to read a large number of those tags. So with that 840 EID, electronic identification device, we are able to scan that device with a low frequency radio frequency and capture that number, which really reduces the time needed to capture a large number of animals as well, especially in movement. When these animals are moving on and off a trailer, great time to capture that ID. But getting that record into our database system so that these animals are traceable in a disease event.
So let's talk a little bit about how the system works, okay? This whole disease traceback system. We've got premise IDs and we've got electronic ear tags. How do they come together?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally how that starts and how we would be notified is slaughter surveillance. So we can use tuberculosis as an example. So TB in cattle, there's slaughter surveillance at our slaughter facilities. If an inspector on the processing line sees something of concern, they will stop the line, pull that animal out to the side, but then first thing they're gonna do is read that official ID that is attached to that animal. When they have that official ID is linked to that producer's premises ID. So when you link those two numbers together, that allows us to rapidly identify the farm of origin and give them the most heads up possible so that we can stop movement, we can take a look, assess the situation, and take that next step forward in order to protect our Indiana agriculture.
And, you know, I think I've heard you and maybe even Dr. Marsh talk about how rapid that response has been for us here in Indiana. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure, absolutely. So over 10 years ago, we've adopted a database that's now used by 17 states, the USA Herds database. And what that is it's no more than matching kind of a telephone book information of premises ID with numbers. And what that allows us to do is when we're given that number, that ID that's in these cattle's ears, we can find that number in under 6 minutes. With the national average in other states, usually under 24 hours is as quick as they can get it, but in Indiana, under 6 minutes.
And I think Indiana kind of leads, the nation in premise ID numbers, okay, which is one of the key pieces to this. Is that right?
Absolutely. So it's the marriage of both the official identification with the premise identification. So we need to know the cow's number and where the cow is located. If you do not have either piece, it's really difficult to get back to that source farm. So Indiana is actually one of only 2 states in the country with registered premises ID for all livestock species. And we currently have over 67,000 registered premises in the state.
And that's across all species, right?
All livestock species, correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you've explained why the change to EID tags is an important step, okay? And I think we've talked about the marriage, how the system works, the marriage of the premise ID and the EID tag. So now what's the benefit to the producer?
Yeah, absolutely. So the benefit of the producer is going to be that long term. So when these breeding animals, and that's what this new program that we're rolling out at the 1st of October is really targeting breeding animals, animals that are going to stay in your herd a little longer. Let this be your management number. Let it be an inventory number, if you will, on how you keep track of it. Because if you use this number and built it into your management systems, then it's a useful number to you as well as us. So if we both use this number in a similar manner, then there is value all around. And so that allows us to then contact you, the producer, rapidly. So if we as the state government in Indiana are able to do this efficiently and use judicious taxpayer dollars, those are your dollars, right, that fund us, we want to be judicious of that dollar through the entire process. So help us help you find if there's a disease of significance in your area.
And I think, and what I've said to producers is that, it actually protects me as a producer, because if there happens to be a disease outbreak, and, we just come through the COVID-19 thing, all right? And so we kind of know how diseases can spread. There's a number of countries around the globe that have got foot and mouth disease. And if we ever get that one is a highly contagious disease.
Absolutely.
And if we have an outbreak and, it's 50 miles away from my place, I can, as a producer, am not located there. Okay. I'm not inside the circle. And so I can still remain in commerce. All right. Where if I'm inside the circle, then I probably will be quarantined, right? And so I think one of the values of this is knowing that you're not part of the disease problem, as well as knowing that you are part of the disease problem. And I think that's comforting to me as a producer, I think.
Absolutely. And we've seen this in the COVID response as well. When you have no information, you have to take these broad blanket approaches because you don't know what you don't know. What these EIDs on top of the premise IDs really allow us to do is to take a precision response and really focus on the herds at hand that are the highest risk to a disease spread. And instead of just saying, nope, we don't know where it's at, so we have to do this broad blanket, we can kind of narrow in our focus and really focus on the herds of most concern.
One of the last things that I'd like for you to talk a little bit about is, there's going to be, USDA has bought a lot of electronic tags, and they're going to be distributed to the states, okay, for accessed by producers free until the supply is gone, right? So
Correct.
Let's talk a little bit about the free tags that as a producer I might be able to access.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting August 1st, we'll have available on the BOA website, which is BOA, BOAH.in.gov. We'll have access for the producers and veterinarians to fill out a form and request tags from the USDA. And what that allows us to do is we will go through them, we'll process that order for you, submit it on your behalf to the USDA, and then they'll actually direct ship those tags right to your farm. No cost to the producer at all through that process. And so what these tags look like are your traditional 840 tags. So this is your typical 840 RFID tag. You can kind of see it right there. And again, that's going to be a 15-digit number that is associated with your premise ID. So the one thing I will ask is when you go to order these tags, these free tags through our website, make sure you have your premises ID card on hand or know your premises ID number. Again, that's a 7-digit alphanumeric number that always starts with the number 00. Have that in hand. We'll ask that in the ordering process, but just a few questions and it'll be pretty easy to get that in.
Kyle, thank you so much. Well, before I stop, I guess, is there anything else that we need to add to this discussion?
No, I mean, we're just encouraging producers. Again, we don't know what brand. There's a couple different brands. We're not sure what tagger you may need, but just know these tags are free, generally $2 to $3 a piece. But while supplies last, we are offering them to our Indiana producers free of charge.
And let me just add to that. You're going to have the right ear tagger.
Yes.
Okay, to do this. And I know some people have used their traditional dangle tag, okay, ear tagger, and that will oftentimes crush the components inside that tag that allow it to be read.
Yep.
And so you get some tag failures. So producers will have to buy the correct ear tagger, okay, to apply whatever tags arrive in this free form.
Yep, absolutely. And we always caution your frustration levels will increase if you're not using the right tag. So we really do encourage to use the right tagger and getting these tags in.
Kyle, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a good discussion.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
This month's production and management tips, I'd like to start out with some things for you to consider. First of all is finalize your last day harvest to prevent freeze damage of those plants. We're getting to that point where we're probably within 6 weeks of a frost, and plants need recovery time after they've been mowed or grazed, okay, particularly whenever we get down into that 2-3 inches of plant height. And the key piece here is that those plants have adequate time to recover carbohydrate reserves and their storage structures to be able to overwinter, and obviously then to come back with nice growth next spring. In spring calving cow herds, think about low stress weaning, okay? That could be a fence line weaning, that could be using nose flaps, okay, to do the 2-stage weaning process, or maybe even abrupt weaning where you separate cows and calves out of sight, out of sound. Also consider castration, dehorning, vaccination, and deworming of calves. In other words, preconditioning these calves. We know that preconditioned calves also shrink less than calves that are pulled right off mom, loaded on the truck, and taken to the auction market. And now's a good time to start thinking about doing your final preg check for the season in the spring calving cow herds, so we don't have to spend the extra money for feeding of a cow that will not return us income this next year. In fall calving cow herds, we need to start thinking about vaccinating these cows before the beginning of the breeding season. And most vaccines actually increase the cytokine levels in the blood and also increase body temperature slightly due to a mild infection due to the immune response to that vaccine. And so the recommendation is that cows be vaccinated at least 3 weeks prior to breeding so that these vaccines do not have a negative effect on conception rate and when the breeding season starts. The other part of that vaccination idea is that these newborn calves that are being born this fall probably need to have a Clostridia vaccine along with maybe something else, okay, according to your veterinarian's recommendations. Another key factor is to start thinking about preparing for the upcoming breeding season. Doing breeding soundness evaluations on bulls, adjusting body condition scores of not only the bulls, but the cows and your replacement heifers. Make sure that your replacement heifers are on target to reach 60% or 65% of their mature weight going into the breeding season, and also think about ordering any breeding supplies that you might need, estrus synchronizing drugs, semen, AI gloves, whatever it might be. And now's a good time to start thinking about finalizing the selection of your replacement heifers. In the case of fall pastures, there's a lot of the biennial and perennial weed species that are still actively growing on into the fall. And these particular plants are particularly susceptible to a fall application of herbicide. And so if you decide that you've got weeds that need to be controlled, consider these biennials and perennial species that are still actively growing with a herbicide application. When you use a herbicide, make sure that you check the label for residual activity and restrictions. Some of them have grazing restrictions, some of them have restrictions in terms of how soon you can come back and add things like red clover in a frost city scenario or whatever. So make sure that you read the label, okay, for residual activity and restrictions. In the case of sorghums and sedans and the sorghum sedan hybrids, okay, those plants are susceptible to producing prussic acid after a frost. So we might think about grazing prior to a frost to avoid that prussic acid. And if we don't get that grazing done before a freeze, okay, not necessarily a killing freeze, but just a freeze, all right? Those plants, if they regrow shoots, those new shoots are particularly dangerous in terms of prussic acid. So if you can't get it grazed before frost, then you probably need to wait until after a killing frost, about 5 to 7 days after a killing frost before you go back and graze it. That makes that plant, allows the prussic acid, which is really a hydrocyanic acid, to dissipate, and then that forage becomes safe again. In upcoming programs and events, Hoosier Beef Congress is scheduled to take place December 4th through the 6th at the Indiana State Fairgrounds. The National Western in Denver, unfortunately, has been canceled for 2021. Indiana Beef Cattle Convention is going to be held January 23rd, 2021 in Danville, Indiana this year to reduce costs, okay, for participation. That's at the Hendricks County Fairgrounds and Convention Center. Regional beef meetings. We typically have 10 regional beef meetings scattered around the state. This year, because of social distancing and serving food, we're going to move this to a virtual event this year. And we'll have one program to be broadcast statewide. The format will be similar to in the past. And we're going to have a panel discussion as part of that program. We're still working on what date that will be, but it'll probably be in early January. If you've been enjoying Beef Monthly, please do us a favor and tell your friends. Give us a thumbs up below this video and hit the subscribe button and the bell next to it for notifications when the next issue is posted. Beef Monthly is published the third Friday of each month by noon. We look forward to seeing you again next month.
This presentation was a production of the Animal Science Department at Purdue University.